You might think that sounds impressive, but I wrote it myself. So, also, you might have noticed I dropped some business cards around the room. And the main reason for that is if you really like this presentation, I want you to know that, you know, I do weddings and bar mitzvahs, communions, and well, at any rate, I hope you like the talk tonight. It's on the past Grand Secretaries of the Grand Lodge of New York. And we're going to start with a little video. Hopefully this will work. And it's the reason why I wanted to talk about the past Grand Secretaries. Hi, this is the Grand Secretary, and this is my office. One of the great things about this office is the portraits that are on the wall here. It's not only a huge, tremendously huge office, but it has such history and character to it. Now there was a sweeping view of it all, and certainly the first thing you notice when you come in is the portraits on the wall. You just can't help but see them. And that's what actually got me interested in giving this lecture on the past Grand Secretaries. This one here, the one that's right near the door to my office, is Dr. James Austin. He was Grand Secretary in the middle of the 19th century for 28 years. And he served through some difficult times. Over here, on the top there is Most Worshipful Bob Singer, who was the Grand Secretary in the early 90s after Wendell Walker. Now, if you take a look on the wall behind me here, you'll see some local color. Basically, I have a Beatles poster up there, so that's part of my contributions to the room. And I usually catches people's attention. But on the wall here also are two Grand Secretaries. The one on the top is Ed Carman, who served in the 50s, and George Irving, who served in the 40s. This clock here is a result of a gift from a past Grand Master's family, given as a gift about 100 years ago. The two big portraits over here on the wall are two long-standing Grand Secretaries. The one right here, this is Robert Judson Kenworthy, who was Grand Master from Grand Secretary from 1917 to 1931. The one over here on the left, that's Charles Johnson, and he picked up after Most Worshipful Kenworthy in 1931 and served through 1946. Both of these two past Grand Secretaries are also Grand Masters. Now, just turning around again across from my desk, you'll see two past Grand Secretaries here. The one on the top is Wendell Walker, who served from 1963 to 1990, 27 years as Grand Secretary. The one down here on the bottom is John Wells, who served from 1805 to 1816, most of the term that DeWitt Clinton was Grand Master. Along the wall over here, you'll see Most Worshipful Gary Henningsen, who was Grand Secretary in the mid-90s. And then on the bottom, Right Worshipful Gil Savitsky, who was the Grand Secretary in the early 21st century. The next two over here on the wall is Most Worshipful Vincent LeBone. He was Grand Secretary for 2 years, and he was replaced by Right Worshipful Paul Rosen, who served almost 4 years, just passing away in 2018. This somber-looking guy here on the wall, that's James Herring. He was Grand Secretary in the 1840s, and also was Grand Secretary of one of the schism lodges, the Phillips Grand Lodge, in the 1850s. The longest serving Grand Secretary is over here in this corner. This is Edward Earle. He was Grand Secretary from 1881 to 1917, a total of 36 years. And to his right is a plaque that was erected by the Grand Lodge in 1917 here on this wall that recognizes Brother Earle's expertise and professionalism, and also mentions his service to the Grand Lodge as well. So as you go, if you look around the room here, you'll see it's quite a big office that I have here. It's really something to see. Along the, you'll see mementos and pictures of my family here, and books, and of course my desk, which is over here on the side. In Earle's day, he would have his desk up here near this window that my back is towards, and he would look out like this. I use this area as just a sitting area. You'll see it has a couch and an easy chair, and it has a chair from the Grand Lodge room, for which I made a donation. In the back here in my office is also a bathroom and a separate room that I could use as a lounge in a private area. So my talk this evening on the past Grand Secretaries, it has its origin in me trying to find out more about my predecessors, in part because I figure these are the guys that someday my portrait might hang with, and I'd like to know who I'm hanging with. So I hope you like my lecture this evening, and I'll try to make it interesting for you. That's a little preview. Thank you very much. All right, I hope you like that. There we go. Okay, so I could end the lecture right here if you really liked it, but I really thought of the video as kind of like an overture of the presentation. And there were 29 Grand Secretaries, including myself, of the legitimate Grand Lodge. And there were several acting Grand Secretaries as well. At first I thought there were perhaps just 3 or 4 acting Grand Secretaries, but there are actually a lot more, because a lot of these Grand Secretaries actually died in office. You'll notice on the slide up here that 10 of them were Grand Masters. 10 of the 29 were Grand Masters, including 2 honorary past Grand Masters. And there are also 6 Grand Lodge Schism Grand Secretaries. And I'm not going to go into all of the schisms or anything else like that, but when we get to the proper slide, I'll at least talk about it a little bit. I'm not the most knowledgeable about those schisms, other than to say that in their day, they caused a lot of havoc. And I'm the 29th Grand Secretary. Okay, so the early Grand Secretaries. First off, it's difficult to find out about a lot of these guys. You know, it was a turbulent time back then. We received our charter, I believe, September 5th, 1781. I think that's the date. At any rate, and it was given to Reverend Walter to be the first Grand Master, and there was names in there for the junior ward and the deputy Grand Master, etc. It was there on the charter. There was no one who stepped forward was William Cook, and he's our first, William Cock, I'm sorry. He's our first Grand Secretary, and he ultimately became the Grand Master, as Reverend Walter was actually someone that sided with the British, and in 1781, you know, the British had to begin to evacuate from the United States as we won the Revolutionary War, as you may know, as you certainly know. So these are the first 5 Grand Secretaries. You'll see that at least for 2 years there, in one of the terms, there were actually co-Grand Secretaries. Now, William Cock, he served as the first Grand Secretary, and then as Reverend Walter evacuated New York, he stepped in to be the junior Grand Warden, and then by the end of the year, he became the Grand Master, as he, you know, he didn't evacuate. He was an American, so to speak. His profession was lawyer. He was a register in the county clerk's office, and that's what he did. In 1780, okay, so here it is. Here's the chart of the early years of the Grand Lodge. We were charted September 5th, 1781, and Reverend William Walter was named Grand Master. He was the rector of Trinity Church in Boston. The first meeting of the Grand Lodge was held in Oubliette Assembly Hall. It was apparently a tavern, and that's where William Cook was selected as Grand Secretary. James Clark was selected as Deputy Grand Secretary, and James Clark, who became the second Grand Secretary, was also the Secretary of the same lodge as Reverend Walter. And just like I just mentioned, there was a lot of turbulence back then, and Reverend Walter evacuated with the British troops, and William Cock eventually became Grand Master that same year, very late in the year. First he became Junior Grand Warden early in the year, and then he became Grand Master late in the year. It's something to point out that back then there were several meetings that took place of the Grand Lodge in a year. They didn't just meet in May like we do now. And so, you know, these kind of elections could be held pretty much any time. Okay. So when eventually James Clark, who took over for William Cock in 1783, he eventually left, and Charles Horton became the third Grand Secretary. He was selected Secretary Pro Tem in 1784. The next couple of Grand Secretaries, these are the two men that served as co-Grand Secretaries in from 1784 to 1786. First, each of these men had their own. I can't tell you the reason why they served as co-Grand Secretaries, although I suspect it's just simply to divide up the work, and because one probably couldn't take it all the time. The first one, James Giles, he was a Revolutionary War general, and he served mostly in Canada and northern New York State. He was a well-known general, and the Marquis de Lafayette, presented his sword as a gift to him, and it's now in the New Jersey State Museum in Trenton. He moved to New Jersey in 1788 and practiced law and banking until his death in 1825 at the age of 65. He was a founding member of Brewery Masonic Lodge in Bridgeton, New Jersey, which is still operating today. The second co-Grand Secretary at the time was John Lawrence. He was a colonel in the Revolutionary War, and he was also a lawyer, and he was a district court judge, and he was a prominent politician of the day. And he was elected, as you can see here, to the New York State Assembly, to the U.S. Congress, and he was eventually Senator from New York. Now, William Koch gave up the Grand Mastership in 1986 in order that Chancellor Robert R. Livingston could be the Grand Master. And the next slide you see up here are all of the Grand Secretaries that served Chancellor Robert R. Livingston. First is James Scott. He served from 1786 to 1788. Jacob Morton, who eventually became Grand Master. He served from 1788 to 1792. He was a general in the Revolutionary War, and both him and Scott and Abrams, who you see as the number 8 Grand Secretary and the number 9 Grand Secretary, R.J. Vandenbroek, they pretty much got together on a regular basis to run things in the Grand Lodge, as Chancellor Robert R. Livingston was a very busy man. So first it was Morton who served, first it was Scott, and then Morton, and then John Abrams, and then Reiner, John Vandenbroek were the Grand Secretaries under Robert R. Livingston. Now you'll notice on this one that John Abrams passed away in office, and R.J. Vandenbroek was appointed as the Grand Secretary, and that's how he got the job. Just another one of those things. Following this group of men was Daniel D. Tompkins, who eventually became Grand Master from 1820 to 1822. He served as Grand Secretary under Jacob Morton, when Jacob Morton was Grand Master. He was a lawyer. He was also a very prominent politician, and very early in his career, he had a lot of success as a politician. He became governor of New York from 1807 to 1817. He had a very strong political following. He eventually became vice president under James Monroe from 1817 to 1825. During that time, he became Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New York. Now, when he was governor of New York, he served for 10 years, and then he became vice president under James Monroe. But at some point in time, him and DeWitt Clinton, became, I'm not going to say enemies, but rivals. And he didn't care for what DeWitt Clinton was doing, and he felt the state owed him money, and because he laid out things and stuff. So he ran for governor in 1820, but he did lose. Apparently he had a lot of financial misdealings, and he died impoverished in 1825, just shy of his 51st birthday. He is buried here in New York City at St. Mark's Church, though. In the early 19th century, first is the 11th Grand Secretary, that's John Wells, and he served for 12 years, serving basically 2 Grand Masters. He served Jacob Morton for 1 year, and then he served 12 terms under DeWitt Clinton, who was Grand Master for 16 years. He was appointed when Daniel Tompkins resigned his post as Grand Secretary in 1805, but then he was subsequently elected. And if you noticed, he was one of the portraits in my office there. Interesting enough, in the 1820s, there was a schism between the Grand Lodge of New York and what's known as the country Grand Lodges. And apparently this had this had its origin in the fact that all of the meetings of the Grand Lodge were held down here in New York City. But yet the Grand Lodge covered the entire state. And it wasn't that easy to travel way back whenever, obviously. And so it was overwhelmingly, the voters at these Grand Lodge meetings were from the city. So the country guys kind of thought, the upstate guys thought they had a raw deal and they wanted to form their own Grand Lodge. And they did for a few years there. And John Wells was first elected as the Grand Master of the Country Grand Lodge, but he refused to serve. Eventually that schism did heal after a few years. The next Grand Secretary you see up here is Elias Hicks. He was a member of Holland Lodge number 8, and he also served during the time of the Morgan affair when William Morgan disappeared in September 1826 and precipitated anti-Masonic fervor across the nation. Succeeding him was Oliver M. Lowndes, who served as Grand Secretary under Most Worshipful Stephen Van Rensselaer. Now, Van Rensselaer was a member of the Country Grand Lodge, but by the time he was elected Grand Master, they had got the schism back under control, and the Country Grand Lodge re-merged with the City Grand Lodge, the legitimate Grand Lodge. In that time that there was a Country Grand Lodge, there were several Grand Secretaries of the Country Grand Lodge, and you see them up here. Charles Haynes, John Oakley, and Ebenezer Wadsworth. Now, following in the years after 1826, there was a fair amount of anti-Masonic fervor across the country, and James Herring, one of the other Grand Secretaries you saw on my wall, he was right in the center of it, in a sense, in that this was the worst time for the Morgan affair and the anti-Masonic fervor. He served from 1829 to 1846 in the legitimate Grand Lodge. He, throughout his time, he tried to correct this, but there was a lot of poor record keeping by the lodges, and there was a lack of Grand Lodge dues payments that resulted in the forfeiture of a lot of lodges, a lot of charters. For instance, there were 264 lodges in 1834, but 195 of them were delinquent. So that's one thing. During this time, they also. Thank you. During this time, the first plans for the Masonic Hall and Home were drawn up, and that was 1845. And then finally, in the late 1830s until 1850, when they came back in the fold, there was a St. John schism that happened, and there was a past Grand Secretary of that schism, Charles Lindbeck. In 1846 to 1850, we have Robert Boyd. He was elected Grand Secretary. At the time, there was he helped oversee the union of the St. George Schism in 1850, but at the same time, there was a major upheaval that caused another schism with what's known as the Phillips Grand Lodge after the Grand Master the first Grand Master of this other Grand Lodge. Now, I can't say exactly what all of the problems were with the schisms, but it had a lot to do with voting and voting power and that type of thing. At any rate, during that time, there were also Grand Secretaries from the schism, Robert McCoy and James Herring. And if you notice, James Herring was not only the past Grand Secretary from just the earlier decade, but he also became Grand Secretary of the Phillips Grand Lodge that existed from 1849 to 1858. In 1850, James W. Powell assumed the office of Grand Secretary, and then he helped finalize the St. John Schism and bring them back in the fold, and that's when they actually purchased the Masonic Hall and Home area upstate New York. And they also began making plans for an erection of a Grand Lodge building. One of the most important Grand Secretaries, and one you saw on my wall as you walked in, if you walked in the office, would be Dr. James Austin. He served 28 years as Grand Secretary, the second longest tenure, and he served the second most number of Grand Masters. And you think about the years he served, 1853 to 1881, they were pretty turbulent years in the country, and they were pretty turbulent years in the Grand Lodge of New York. But he lasted through them. He was able to get the Grand Lodge, Phillips Grand Lodge schism under control, and they signed the union with them in 1858. And the Articles of the Union were signed by Dr. Austin and James Herring, the past Grand Secretary you also saw on the opposite end, on the opposite side of the wall of my office. And obviously, he was the Grand Secretary during the Civil War and Reconstruction. He was a medical doctor. It was at this time that the standard ritual work was defined, and trying to establish the ultimate uniformity of the ritual throughout the state. The Grand Lecture was established in this period of time in 1855. And the Grand Lodge Library was first conceived and formed. The District Deputy Grand Master system was installed in 1858 when the schism ended. He died in office December 2nd, 1881, and he was succeeded by Edward M. Earle, who was appointed acting Grand Secretary until his subsequent election in 1882. Now, Edward M. Earle is the longest serving Grand Secretary. You also saw him on the wall of my office, and you noticed that he had a plaque there. There was a plaque put up there as well. He served 36 years from 1881 to 1917, and I find that fact amazing. That's quite a lifetime. On the other hand, I only read the other day about a past Grand Secretary. He was past Grand Secretary in Texas, that he served 55 years as Grand Secretary. So he must have been a boy when he went in. Well, at any rate, Edward Earle has served 22 Grand Masters over his term. He was born in Denmark in 1840, and he fought in the Civil War. He went in as a private. He was wounded twice in the battles of Antietam and Fredericksburg in 1862. He eventually rose in rank to become a colonel, and he was involved in Reconstruction efforts in Georgia after the Civil War, before returning to New York City as a commissioner of the New York Customs House. He was raised in Continental Lodge number 287 in 1865. Eventually, he became honorary past Grand Master in 1901. And as Grand Secretary, he presided over many ceremonies, including the laying of the cornerstones of the Egyptian obelisk in Central Park and at the Statue of Liberty in 1884. He presided as master at the raising of President Theodore Roosevelt in the Tinnacock Lodge on April 24, 1901. He is, most of the procedures that you find in the office of the Grand Secretary have their origin with this Grand Secretary. There's a huge card catalog that was established around the turn of the century, and this was due to him. And he was quite on top of the office there. He died on May 28, 1917, and Most Worshipful Robert Judson Kenworthy was appointed to fill his office for the unexpired term as Grand Secretary. Another portrait in my office, Robert Judson Kenworthy. He served as Grand Secretary from the time of Edward Earle's death until his own death in 1931. He was a member of the advertising profession and was raised in Montauk Lodge number 286 in Brooklyn in 1889. He was a charter member and president of the Brooklyn Masonic Guild. He was Grand Marshal under Most Worshipful Townsend Scudder from 1905 to 1908. And he was Grand Master from 1910 to 1912. As Grand Master, he was the force behind the Daniel D. Tompkins Chapel up in Utica at the Masonic Care Community. The Tompkins Chapel was completed in 1911 and dedicated on June 25th, 1911. He was appointed in May 1917 to fill Edward Earle's term as Grand Secretary, and then subsequently elected. And like I mentioned, he died in office June 7, 1931, at the age of 70. Frederick Milligan was appointed acting Grand Secretary from June 1931 to May 1932. Frederick Milligan worked in the Grand Secretary's office for 44 years, beginning in 1887 as an assistant to Grand Secretary Earle, and then as an assistant to Grand Secretary Kenworthy. In May 1932, he retired, and he was given the title Grand Secretary Emeritus and provided a lifetime salary. Succeeding R. Judson Kenworthy is Charles Henry Johnson. And he was elected Grand Secretary in 1932, and he served until 1947. He was an upstate Grand Master. He was raised in, I think it's Ancient City Lodge, and now he's a member, which is now I think Ancient Temple Lodge. But he was an upstate Grand Master, even though he was born in Brooklyn. And right after Kenworthy passed away, he demitted from the upstate Grand Lodge and he joined Holland Lodge, number 8. So he's kind of like, he was an upstate guy, but because the Grand Secretary is, since the schisms, Articles of Union required that the Grand Secretary and Grand Treasurer come from downstate, he was, if he wanted to be Grand Secretary, he needed to be from a lodge from downstate, and so he joined Holland Lodge number 8. Now, he had a number of degrees, and the degrees were in theology, and he was a member of many community-based organizations, including State's Commission on Social Welfare. He became one of the nation's leading authorities and advocates on the care of children, orphans, mental health, offenders against the penal law, and the underprivileged. And he gave lectures constantly and published many articles and pamphlets. He served at the time of his raising. he served as the orphan asylum's superintendent. He was elected Grand Master from 1930 to 32. You've seen that before. And then he joined Holland Lodge at the end of 1931 in order to become the Grand Secretary. He was elected Grand Secretary Emeritus when he retired from the job in May 1947, and he died about a year and a half later in October 1948 at age 76. And many of you may have heard his name because he's associated with the Charles Johnson Medal, which is given out by Grand Lodge. Now the post-World War II era, I have two Grand Secretaries up there. One is George Irving, who was a medical doctor. He's a well-regarded pediatrician in the United States throughout his life, and he was a very active pediatrician, even as Grand Secretary. He was raised in 1919 in Continental Lodge number 287, which is the same lodge that Edward Earle came from. He was Grand Treasurer in the mid-30s from 1933 to 1935. After Charles Johnson had retired in 1947, he did win election as Grand Secretary. And he died in office April 14, 1952 at age 56. And it was the same day that the sitting Deputy Grand Master, George A. Barnwell, also died on that exact same day. So they were 1 month away, less than a month away from the annual communication, and they had to replace not only the Grand Secretary, but they had to replace the Deputy Grand Master at the time. So that must have been very interesting. Clarence Glass was named acting secretary to fill the remainder of his term. The second name you see on this list here, Edward R. Carman. He was a lawyer. He was raised in 1910 in Jamaica Lodge number 546. So I am not the first Grand Secretary from the Queens District. Ed Carman was. And Ed Carman, and both, by the way, Ed Carman and George Irving, you saw in those small pictures on the wall of my office as well. Ed Carman served as Grand Marshal under Most Worshipful Charles Furzel from 1944 to 1945. He served as Grand Treasurer in 1951, and he served 9 years as Grand Secretary from 1952 to 1963, which is the height of Masonry in New York State. He was elected Grand Secretary Emeritus at the end of his term in 1863, doesn't it? So, but he was elected Grand Secretary Emeritus in 1963. Now, following Ed Carman, I'm going to put up a slide. I'm going to call it the modern era, but I'm not quite sure it's the modern era. It's the last 56 odd years, starting in 1963, when Wendell Walker began serving his term as Grand Secretary. And I'm going to talk about each one of these Grand Secretaries, including myself here. So, first among them is Wendell Walker. He served 27 years as Grand Secretary, and that's really an amazing feat, from 1963 to 1990. So that's in the modern era. I remember Earle served 36 years, but it bridged the 19th and 20th century, and Dr. Austin served 28 years, but that was also in the middle of the 19th century. So in the modern era, Wendell Walker served 14 Grand Masters over 27 years. He was born and raised in Michigan, and he was a sickly child who became an avid reader. And what did he do? He did what Joseph did. He went and he got himself a degree from library science. So he was actually the director of the Grand Lodge Library here. And he became the Grand Lodge the director of the library here after receiving his library science degrees. He was actually raised in a Michigan lodge in 1932, but later became a member in Independent Royal Lodge number 2 in 1937 because he took the job here in New York as director of the library. And he became master in 1947, IRA number 2. He was very prominent in the war. He enlisted in the U.S. Army as a private. He served in World War II in several campaigns, including Sicily, Italy, and France. He rose in rank to captain by war's end, and after the war he was called back as a major for the Korean War, and later as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve. He became District Deputy Grand Master in 1955-56 under Most Worshipful Raymond C. Ellis. And he was, like I mentioned here, he was librarian director of the Grand Lodge Library Museum 1934 to 1963. He received numerous awards, including the Distinguished Achievement Award in 1987. He was elected honorary past Grand Master in May 1979 by acclaim. Anyone that knew Most Worshipful Wendell Walker would call him a very strong man, but he did not overly. He was a quiet man. He was a strong man, but quiet. He wasn't one to talk long at these things, and he could certainly do it. But if you called on him to talk in a lodge or an installation, he would be a few words and generally say, "Thank you. I'm glad to be here." He passed away in January 1991. Succeeding Wendell Walker is Bob Singer, who was also Grand Master in the mid-'80s. He was raised in 1953 in Publicity Lodge number 1000 by his father, who was also a past master of Publicity Lodge number 1000. He had degrees in journalism and mass communications from New York University, and he taught political science at NYU as well. He served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, and he founded the Floral Park Dispatch and served as publisher for 3 years. That's where he lived. He lived in Floral Park, and he was a member of many community-based organizations there, including being elected as deputy mayor, police commissioner, and a village trustee. He was appointed District Deputy Grand Master of the 4th Manhattan District in 1965. He was elected Grand Treasurer in 1982, Deputy Grand Master from 84 to 85, and Grand Master from 86 to 87. And I know Most Worshipful Stuart C. McLeod II is here, Grand Marshal for Most Worshipful Bob Singer was his father, Most Worshipful Stuart C. McLeod. I'm going to say senior, for lack of a better way to put it. He was elected as Grand Secretary in 1991, and he served until his own death on November 6, 1994. At the time of his death, Rick Bateman, who still works upstairs in the office, filled in as acting Grand Secretary until the May 1995 annual communication. In fact, Rick was hired during Bob Singer's tenure as Grand Secretary, and that's when, I mean, if you think about what happened in the 1990s, it was when we first got the first database systems for Grand Lodge. I think it was called MLSS and not Maury. And Bob was, the guy behind that. He was the guy behind getting out a lot of these forms, like the annual return, and trying to help lodges report their information on their members to Grand Lodge. The next one up here is Most Worshipful Gary A. Henningsen, and many of you may know him. He was raised in, and of course, Gary is still with us. I don't mean that in a bad way, but there are 3 living Grand Secretaries, and Most Worshipful Gary A. Henningsen is one of them. He was raised in Aurora Grada Daystar Lodge, number 796 in the 3rd Kings District in 1960. He held various lodge offices, including Master, and he was a protege of Most Worshipful Raymond C. Ellis, who was a past Grand Master and a member of the same lodge. He was an active member and senior DMLA of the Theodore Roosevelt chapter in Brooklyn. He received the DMLA Legion of Honor in 1995. He was the proprietor of the family business, which was a floor shop, Henningsen Florist, in Brooklyn, New York. He was appointed District Deputy Grand Master of the 3rd Kings District under Most Worshipful Bruce Widger from 1987 to 1989. He served as the president of the Brooklyn Masonic Guild. He was also active in various community associations, including serving for 20 years as a coach or advisor for Little League Baseball. And he did win an award. The league, the Brooklyn League that he was an advisor for, also gave him an award of distinguished achievement for his long-lasting tenure helping Brooklyn Little League. Most Worshipful Henningsen became Grand Master from 1993 to 1995. He had succeeded Most Worshipful Sheldon Blank, who died in office on April 4th, 1993, after serving just 11 months as Grand Master. After Most Worshipful Bob Singer died, he was elected Grand Secretary on May 2nd, 1995. He served until 2004, and those of you who do know him know that he is particularly proud of mentioning his Viking heritage. He was elected Grand Secretary Emeritus in 2004, awarded the Distinguished Achievement Award in 1999. He was an active 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite and a member or an honorary member of many concordant bodies. He's married to his wife Ada, who was a former Triangle girl. He married her in 1960. The union produced 3 sons, all of whom became Master Masons, and a daughter who was a past queen in the Order of Triangles. Now 80 years old, he lives in New Jersey with his wife Ada. Right Worshipful Gil Savitsky is next. He's number 26. He was raised on March 19, 1963 in Hancock, DeRigo, Adelphi Lodge number 23 of the 1st Manhattan District. His business was being a proprietor of several retail stores, and he was elected trustee of the Masonic Hall and Home from 1985 to 1988. He subsequently was elected Grand Treasurer in 1989 from Most Worshipful, serving from Most Worshipful Roswell, Swiss. In 2004, upon Gary Henningsen's retirement, he was elected Grand Secretary. He served 4 Grand Masters, including Most Worshipful Trozen, Gilbert, and LeBone, retiring in 2012. He was elected Grand Secretary Emeritus in 2012. He's an avid golfer and enjoys sculpting. Some of his pieces were displayed here in Masonic Hall a few years ago. He's an octogenarian who currently lives in Florida with his wife Barbara. Most Worshipful Vincent LeBone. He was our 27th Grand Secretary. He was raised in 1973 in Garibaldi Lodge, number 542. He's the proprietor and president of Ennoble Partitions. And if you look at Ennoble, that's LeBone spelled backwards. It's an interior construction company. He retired in 2012. I believe he made he created construction for the toy building. The toy manufacturers have to exhibit their wares, and they used to be all done here, just a block away in the toy building. And he worked within sight of Grand Lodge almost his whole life. He served as Grand Marshal over under Most Worshipful Stuart C. McLeod from 1998 to 2000. He was elected Grand Treasurer in 2004 to 2006. He became Grand Master in 2010, and then he was elected Grand Secretary from 2012 to 2014 upon Right Worshipful Savitsky's retirement. He served on several Grand Lodge committees, including the Grand Lodge Convention Committee for almost 30 years. He's an active member in the 10th Manhattan District. He's a 33rd degree Mason of the Scottish Rite, Northern Masonic jurisdiction, and active in several concordant bodies. He lives in Bayside with his wife Ginny. They recently celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 2018. They have 2 married daughters and 3 grandchildren. My immediate predecessor, Right Worshipful Paul Rosen, was Grand Secretary number 29. He was an attorney at law and a former district attorney. He was raised in Fraternity Dunderberg Lodge 942 in 1992. He served as master in that lodge in 1998 to 1999, and again from 2001 to 2002. He was District Deputy Grand Master of the 1st Westchester Putnam District from 2006 to 2008. He was elected Trustee of the Masonic Home and Asylum from 2008 to 2014. And he was appointed Grand Representative to Israel from 2014 till his death. He served as Grand Secretary from 2014 until his death at age 74 on March 12, 2018. And then Richard Bateman served the remainder of his term until May 2018. Rick Bateman served as the acting Grand Secretary. And finally, we get to number 29. And so you all might be bored. You heard my biography before. I certainly don't need to go through all of that again. But I would like to mention a couple of things. First off, I was elected Grand Secretary just 11 months ago. And part of what I feel I've done or I'm about to do, I put on the bottom of this sheet. You'll see it says that I extended the office hours in the Grand Lodge office to 2 nights a week till 8 o'clock. I know when I was secretary of my lodge, I'd always have to run over here at lunchtime and make sure somebody was here to receive something from me because the Grand Lodge closed at 4:30. So, having it open 2 nights a week definitely helps those secretaries that need to drop stuff off in the office, or even if they just want to buy a ritual book to go to lodge services and buy a ritual book. You can come in until 8 o'clock in the evening. And then also something I'm working on right now actually is permanent dues cards. Next year, we'll be working with dues cards that are actually like credit cards. It'll have a QR code on it, and they'll be mailed directly from Grand Lodge to your home. It won't be mailed from the secretary, although the secretaries will still collect the dues. So that's what's coming later in the year. I've asked for continuous improvement from the workers, personnel, staff in my office, and I hope that amounts to something. Today's challenges, and I'm just going to go through them, laundry list of stuff. Technological advances. I mean, part of what the Office of the Grand Secretary should do, and part of continuous improvement, is to increase the automation in the office as much as possible, to encourage greater internet and email use, and to encourage document management. rather than the old pencil and paper operation, which we still engage in today, by the way. And it's going to be an earthquake when we actually get to save some trees and be able to do indexing of scanned documents and be able to find things in seconds rather than hours or even days. Part of what I'd like to do is increase the responsiveness of the office to the members and provide better customer service. The Secretary's Manual was done in the mid-1990s, and so it's more than 20 years old and needs a complete update. There's also a possibility of using the internet here for e-learning tools and using more videos. And then just having more efficient office procedures and guidelines. So one of the things I'm undertaking is a review of the Grand Lodge forms and the procedures we use. And then, and that might result in something. Any secretary that's in this room knows how long it takes to fill out by hand the certificate of election. Because you can't do it on the computer. Yeah, you can do it in Maury and everything else. But we say we want this. We not only want it electronically, but we want it on a form. Well, can't the form be a lot shorter or easier to produce than to do it by hand? And so certainly I think so. I think we do need to upgrade the staff talent in the office. We have some very good people, very dedicated people, but they need to be trained in using more modern tools. Just even knowing how to put an attachment to an email requires training. And I expect we'll be hiring professional personnel as well. I've instituted a review of our IT and HR procedures, and that's also still ongoing. So, you're never going to guess who that is, and it's not me. You know, and I'm sorry if I bored you to death with all of this. This is James Giles. He was the 4th Grand Secretary. He was way early in the presentation. He served, I'm trying to think now, he served in the 1790s. And if you look carefully here, he's wearing a pin there. It's called the Society of Cincinnatus. And many of the Masons at that time were in this society as well. And it's another fraternal organization, one that, is by invitation. I was tracking MW Earle on the internet, and I found out he gave a couple of speeches that are actually preserved as internet downloadable files. Now is coming up MW Earle's talk on Masonic charity.
Fraternities of men have existed in some shape or form during every period of the world's history. Doubtless in the primitive ages, it became apparent that mutual protection would afford the greatest security against the unbroken forces of nature and the evil nature of man, and secure sympathy, support, and protection to those whose bond of union was made a common cause. Hence originated Masonry. The origin of Masonry, like other historical transactions, lies buried in the gloom of obscurity. Its philosophy may be traced to the remotest ages of the world's history. Its symbols are older than the Temple of Solomon and antedate the Pentateuch of Moses. Its ceremonials were practiced in the ancient mysteries when Egypt stood as the first and the most enlightened power of the then known world. Its tenets were known by the nomadic tribes of the East and transmitted from father to son, generation after generation, so that even today, the Bedouin of the desert recognizes the hail of the craftsman. The mission of Masonry is to curb intemperate passion and to reconcile conflicting interests, to extend to nations those principles of humanity and benevolence which should actuate individuals, to destroy the pride of conquest and the pomp of war, to annihilate local prejudices and unreasonable partialities, to banish from the world every source of enmity and hostility, and to introduce those social feelings which are better calculated to preserve peace and good order than penal laws and political regulations.
Ain't it interesting that you can get this stuff off the internet? His voice has been preserved. Here's a man, he spent 36 years as Grand Secretary, and you've just heard him. I think it's terrific. At any rate, I hope you got something out of this. And like I said, I am available for weddings, bar mitzvahs.